Howdy, this is Wiz, and today I'm going to be explaining Markdown, which is a very popular lightweight markup language, which acts as a tool to convert text to HTML. Markdown is very handy in making documentation and creating READMEs, especially on version control software like Git and on Git's web service form, GitHub. It's used very often there, and software developers really like Markdown. It makes documentation very, very easy. And Markdown's biggest goal in documentation is to make it as readable as possible with very, very simple syntax to make documentation really easy to read. Markdown is a lot like HTML, but Markdown uses much less characters, so typos are not as common in Markdown, which I'll display in a second. But right now, what I'm displaying is the GitHub guide to Markdown, and I like this a lot because it's very easy to read and uses GitHub. It uses Markdown itself. Example is this is used using the header tag, like right here. Sorry, like right here. It used this to make all these different headers, or it used a link, it embedded a link for each one of these text messages here. And this guide is really handy to learn Markdown. It shows all the very basic syntax for it, and like this is how you make a header, and this is how you make italics. It's just two different asterisks, on each side makes an italic, and bold is very similar to italics, except it uses it uses two asterisks on both sides to make something bold. This is just one different guide. This is just one guide to understanding Markdown. There's plenty of other sources. I also like this Markdown guide site quite a lot. The Markdown guide site shows all the very simple syntax that comes with it. And that's really the biggest thing behind Markdown, is making your documentation as readable as possible while also limiting the amount of syntax you need. Because, for instance, in regular HTML, this would be like an H1 tag would be like about 4 to 5 characters to make, but it's just accomplished here with this one little hashtag. Same thing for H2. It limits it greatly, the amount of typos you can make, and HTML is a very sensitive language when it comes to typos. This displays basically all the syntax you'll really need for Markdown. If there needs to be anything more added to it, that must be looked up, but to make Markdown more extensible, you have to use regular HTML as a guide. But otherwise, this guide here on markdownguide.org shows all the syntax that most people need on how to make very readable documentation. All it needs is just block quotes, code for little code snippets, and order lists and unordered lists. And they'll go a far way in making things very readable. Other guides is like this. This is a very well-detailed explanation of Markdown and the usefulness of Markdown and how Markdown works and stuff of that nature. That's a little longer to read than that GitHub guide, but it's still a very nice guide for Markdown. And here's a daringfireball.net Markdown guide, which also gives this one gives more of a concise explanation of Markdown. And I recommend all of these different links, the GitHub one especially, and the cheat sheet one especially. But the Markdown guide here, markdownguide.org, is also very handy for an explanation, and same thing with Fireball. On Fireball for for understanding Markdown better. I love Markdown. It's very, very easy to use, and it makes documentation much, much easier. it'll take a little bit of practice to better master Markdown, but with some experience, it can make your documentation much easier to write and much easier to read for everyone. That's all I really have to say about Markdown, guys. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one. See ya.